time with today. I hope you all are, and thank you all again for coming. I'm pleased now to introduce John Harris. Mr. Harris is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Politico newspaper and the website Politico.com. Most of you have heard of Politico.com. I'm not sure how many of you know that there is actually a Politico newspaper. I think Mr. Harris will probably talk a bit about that. We were just chatting about it a minute ago. Mr. Harris is a longtime reporter at the Washington Post and is the author of The Survivor, Bill Clinton in the White House. He's also co-author of The Way to Win, Taking the White House in 2008. Mr. Harris reports that he stumbled into journalism during his freshman year at Carleton College in Minnesota. We discovered that he is an alumnus with our own Professor Pam Lucky. They're both alumni of Carleton, so there may be a conspiracy afoot, I'm not sure. But he started in journalism during his freshman year at Carleton. And when a friend who worked for the student newspaper asked him to write a couple of articles, he says the effect was instantaneous. Surprisingly, it was instantaneously positive. He was certain what he wanted to do with his life from that moment on. And following a fascination with Washington and politics, he was fortunate enough to start a summer internship at the Post 2 days after he graduated from college in 1985. It's a little more difficult to do that now. At the end of the summer, the editors asked him to hang around a while longer. That while ended up being more than 21 years, covering local politics, state politics in Virginia, and national politics. From 1995 to 2001, he covered the Clinton White House. That led to his book. After 20 years as a reporter, he became convinced that at a time when journalism is undergoing wrenching upheavals, everyone who cares about the profession should be involved in answering the question, what's next? Becoming an editor was a way to be more immersed in those conversations about the future, about how to use the web more creatively, about how to sustain serious journalism at a time of diverse threats. His brief editing career led him and Jim Vandehei, who worked with him at the Post and now is his partner at the Politico, to have blue sky conversations about what they would do if they ever had the chance to start a publication about politics from the ground up. Those conversations initially were mostly a way of passing the time. Then in the fall of 2006, they became a lot more serious. Robert Albritton made clear that his notions about the future of journalism were very much in sympathy with theirs. And he offered Messrs. Harris and Vandehei the chance to start something from scratch. That's how they wound up at the Politico and Politico.com. In addition to providing provocative daily coverage, they hope to add something to the conversation about what's next for journalism. And Mr. Harris says they are determined to have fun while doing it, something he says is lamentably in short supply in newsrooms these days. Hear, hear. Please join me in welcoming John Harris.
Delighted to be here in Lexington, a place that I spent many years covering the state of Virginia and the Old Dominions of Lexington. I have not spent as much time here as I might like, but this is familiar territory for me. I'm sending my greetings and also my regrets from must be one of the most famous W&L journalism graduates, Michael Allen of Politico, who's along with Jim Vandehei, who's one of the people that started this, helped us start this joint. And Mike was supposed to be joining us today and speaking tomorrow because of a family, a death in the family of his 96-year-old grandmother. He's occupied with that, but he sends his best wishes and again his regrets. You referred to what we called the blue sky conversations when I was over at the Post with Jim Vandehei and I were contemplating what possibilities existed for a new venture in journalism. That phrase is one we use kind of for public consumption, what we called them at the time, and since were our pass the bong conversations. Because it's not, Judge Kaczynski, I don't mean that literally.
Oh, sure.
there was a kind of a 2 a.m. in the dorm room ethos as we discussed what was where we saw journalism going. We both had very good jobs, responsible jobs at the Washington Post, and yet we also saw, with a mix of dismay and dismay for something that was dying and enthusiasm for something that we thought was being born, we looked at, I've been a lot of time talking about how the world of journalism is changing. With respect to the paper where I grew up and spent 20-some years, and met Tony Losey of the Washington Post is, I don't know, always in some ways the Post is in my blood. I did, and never speak disrespectfully of it, I did believe in the position that I was in, the last position I was in at the Washington Post, which was the national politics editor, in charge of campaign coverage and White House coverage, that the paper was not reckoning adequately with the way that journalism was changing because of the web, and the way that stories would, the way that the audience related to journalism, the kind of reporters who excelled in a web world versus those who excelled in a print world. The Washington Post has a terrific website. It's the second biggest newspaper website in the country after the New York Times. So it's not that they're not thinking about the web, but the reality is the mindset, the institutional rhythms, the way people organize their workday, the way they organize their thinking about any given work week or about their more broadly their career, it is centered on that print newspaper. In that sense, I can't speak to, I won't say 2008, I'll say, but certainly 2006, in that sense, wasn't really that much different than 1906. And that, to me, seemed to be a problem. I was all set to join with other people who were at the Post as sort of collaborators in changing that mindset. At the same time, there was a kind of an entrepreneurial streak in me, and certainly in Jim Van Dyke, my partner at Politico, that, you know what, in this chaotic new media environment in which the old order is crumbling and a new one is not yet constructed, we thought there was a great opportunity to start a publication from scratch. We had a couple of different ideas in mind about how journalism had changed because of the web. The first is it has, in a big way, has disempowered editors. Editors are still vitally important. I am one myself. But the historic function of editors, one big role has been taken away. If you go back, certainly to late 60s, into the 70s, and even into when I started my career in 1985, and you asked, who are the most important people that will determine what gets on the national agenda, at least the national news agenda, for news about national politics and about Washington political personalities and Washington governments? Who are those people? You could literally fit them easily in this room, and I think actually have some room to spare. Let's say it's 1975. Who controls the news? Who would you put in there? Who are the most influential people? Well, you would put the handful of top editors and top political reporters at the Washington Post, also at the New York Times. You probably would add the Wall Street Journal, maybe, if you were stretching a little bit, you would add the Los Angeles Times. On the newspapers, that would be just about it. USA Today, of course, did not exist at that time. You would add the network executive producers and the anchors for the then free, all-powerful newscasts. Of course, CNN, MSNBC, Fox didn't exist. The three evening newscasts with their huge audiences. At that time, you would have put the Washington bureau chiefs and the editors of the 3 weekly news magazines. Obviously then, you know, like the older people in the audience know what I'm talking about. The younger ones, it's probably like it's a shock to you to realize it used to be even a relatively small, the third place magazine, U.S. News and World Report, to be on the cover of that was a huge thing. They announced the other day there is no weekly U.S. News, they're going monthly. Those people, and like I say, we could fit them in this room, were the people that had vast influence on what Americans knew, what they were arguing about, learning about in national politics. People at the Post, that was one of the fun parts of the job. You work at the Washington Post, you get to help set the agenda for national politics. And that role has been demolished by a succession of technological changes. First, cable came along, and CNN came to be a competitor for setting the agenda. About the same time, and with a special ferocity on the right, talk radio competes for setting the agenda. The biggest trend, of course, by far, the emergence of the web in the late 1990s. What does that mean? That means that it used to be the person who had the power was deciding what goes on the front page of the New York Times. Now, anybody with a mouse in front of the computer is his or her own editor. That seems to be, it's a pretty simple thing to describe, but the effects of that in terms of how people relate to news, I think, are powerful. If you're a huge sports fan, you're not going to let the editors of the New York Times tell you what's most interesting about sports, or even the editors of USA Today, which of course even has a better sports section. You're going to go to ESPN.com. If you're a real junkie and you got a tab, ESPN.com, numerous other sites that will give you all the information that you want with much more detail, and I would say also in the context of the web, much more immediacy than you're ever going to get from from more traditional metropolitan dailies or national dailies. Same thing. You're interested in financial news. The Washington Post financial news pages are not going to be satisfying for you. You'll know the sites that you like. We thought that that could be a good thing. We knew the resonance of the political stories that we wrote at the Washington Post, at least those that hit the sweet spot, and somehow something particularly interesting or revelatory to say. We knew that there was a massive audience for those. We could see it in the most read information, the most emailed information. You get one of those stories, it goes viral. Everybody reads it. We would use the fact that everybody is now his or her own editor to our advantage. We formed a website, really by political junkies for political junkies. I'm sorry, I keep returning to my drug motif. That's niche publications, I believe, in this sort of crumbling old order and the new one that's rising. Niche publications have a much more promising future than general interest mass market publication. I mean, I'll say as an aside, addressing kind of the business model of this. The old media powers, big newspapers, big TV news broadcasts, their economic model worked on inefficiency. Maybe at any given time, 6,000 people in the Washington area interested in buying cars. You want to selling Toyotas. You want to reach those people. Tough luck. You're going to pay for all 600,000 of those, and you pay handsomely to do it. Those handsome advertising fees are what made a place like the Washington Post prosperous and made its branded journalism possible. Inefficiency was what was the friend of old media. The web, if it's not among the things it does, is it's the enemy of inefficiency. It's the very nature is that it's efficient. And I think the trick for journalists and those who are thinking about the business viability of journalists is to find a way to make efficiency your friend. That's the theory of the case that we have at Politico. We're advertiser supported, but nobody's coming to our site for Washington Redskins news. Nobody's coming for Fairfax County, Virginia Board of Supervisors news. They're coming for politics. Because the audience is intense and self-defining, in some extent self-limiting, that means that we're attracted to advertisers who want to reach people that have those interests. If you're trying to sell football jerseys, don't come to Politico. Go to ESPN.com. If you're trying to influence Congress to support a accelerated tax depreciation allowance for corn syrup processing, come to our pages, because the people who are probably interested in this subject on Capitol Hill, we feel they're reading us. So the trend toward niche audiences was a powerful one that we felt we wanted to take advantage of. Consistent with that, one of the things the web has done is taken us from an institutional age in journalism to an entrepreneurial age. I'll tell you what I mean by that. When I started my career, the most important thing about me as a journalist was what came after my name. I'm John Harris of the Washington Post. You take your self-esteem, your professional standing, your kind of the swat with which you walk through the world, or not, from the institutional platform that you work for. So you're, cite a friend of mine, Todd Purdom, of the New York Times, or Joe Smith of CBS News. That was what would matter. The institutions were what carried the clout. Increasingly in the web world, readers end up forming, sometimes not even being fully aware of it, relationships with individual reporters. Individual reporters become, in essence, their own franchise. The best example I can think of for this is somebody who's supposed to be here and isn't, Mike Allen. Classic example of somebody who is, in his own way, the franchise. I first knew Mike when we were both young reporters in Richmond. I was with the Washington Post. He was with the Richmond Times Dispatch. He had a very traditional career. Starts at the Fredericksburg Freelance Star, does well, goes to the Richmond Times Dispatch, does well after several years, goes to the Washington Post, does well enough at the Washington Post that somebody at the New York Times says, I've got to hire this guy. Goes to the New York Times, does well enough there that the national staff of the Washington Post, Mike started on Metro, was looking at, we got to have this guy back. Next thing you know, there's a bidding war between the New York Times and the Washington Post. Bidding wars are good. If you're a reporter in the middle who he decided to come back to the Washington Post national staff. We were thrilled until one day Mike surprised us on going to Time magazine to the Washington because Time was looking at seeing the kind of stories that Mike was breaking, and they wanted him. Time was happy until about a year later. Turned out Mike had pretty good friends with these sort of crazy guys starting Politico. And like he said, look, I'm leaving. Look, are you crazy? This is a direct quote from one of his editors, you work for the most prestigious journalism brand in the world. And I guess, in some sense, like in the old world, that's true. But in the new world, doesn't matter if Mike works for Politico or the Washington Post or Time, he is a franchise. Why? He's got there's different ways to build a franchise. Mike builds it by virtue of his terrific energy and the fact that there's nobody more connected in Washington media circles and nobody with a more intuitive sense about how to drive a conversation in the web world. Mike, probably half our traffic at Politico. Good thing he's not here because we would try to demand more pay concessions. Probably half our traffic at Politico comes under Mike Allen's byline because he's so good at being quick, and not just quick and fast the way an Associated Press writer is, but with a keen intuitive sense of like, this one will pop. We'll get this up, and this will be linked everywhere. So that's really how you drive traffic on the web. You get linked around. Only half the traffic we get at Politico, and it's pretty high traffic. We had 5 million last month. Unique visitors put us number 9 among newspapers nationally. The only niche site in the top 20. Still, half our traffic comes sideways through links. Only the other half comes through the front page. Mike's a franchise because he is the talent. We decided to take advantage of that. What we told our investors, the people that back Politico, was, you know what? If you give us the license to go hire these franchise reporters, people who do certain things distinctively well. This person knows Congress better than anybody. This person is got the sort of keenest analysis. It's always the story that ends up illuminating what's really happening in Washington. You hire those franchise people, and we can build a publication. I think in the old pre-web era, to start a new journalistic platform would take years, probably decades, to establish a relationship with sources, a relationship and credibility with advertising, most important, a relationship and credibility with the audience, with the readers. In the web world, we effectively did it from a standing start, betting on these two fairly simple but powerful ideas that in the new world, niche sites have an advantage over general interest sites, and that in the modern journalism world, the reporters are the franchise, and the platform and the institutional name matters relatively less. It still matters, but it matters relatively less. Almost everybody needs a platform of some kind, but it doesn't matter. My friend Mark Halper, with whom I wrote the book, he's attracted a huge audience for the kind of his sort of daily rap on politics. Started at abcnews.com, took it over to Time Magazine. Nobody's going to Time saying, I want to see what their take on Time Magazine's take on politics is. Because I'm going over, I want to see what Halper's take is on the day's news. He's the franchise. So anyway, that's what we launched on 2 years ago. We've been gratified by the results in traffic and impact. We've done the things necessary to that I think are certainly they're necessary for a publication, but I think they're increasingly necessary no matter where you're in, whether you're a new publication or an old publication. You've got to promote your stories. You've got to pay attention to, does this drive the conversation? Is this story interesting enough to sort of move the needle? Now that bothers traditionalists. It bothers me to some extent. I'm a traditionalist. But it is the reality that, it does reflect the reality that to run a news publication in this environment means to be constantly aware of that this is a war. Every day is a war for the audience's attention. Every day is a war for impact and relevancy. Now, to circle that around to the theme of this conference, there are particular hazards to this new sort of mentality in journalism. And it's true that emphatically there are. Politico's greatest moments of pride have come from us taking advantage of the sort of 24/7 news cycle, of us being especially quick off the mark to get a story up, for us being within the boundaries of our journalistic values, which are serious and fairly traditional. Within those boundaries, really playing the story to the hilt and promoting it and not burying the lead, as you say. So you might call it hype. I don't call it hype, but I do live by the apparently there was a dictum on some British tabloid wall, the rule of journalism: first simplify, then exaggerate. That is not true. That's not actually true. But I do believe that it is being boring is not a virtue, and in fact, it's a death sentence in modern journalism. Our greatest triumphs have come from us sort of living by that ethic. We took great satisfaction weeks ago. The New York Times wrote a story about how the news cycle, the nature of the news cycle, has changed this campaign. And there were 3 examples in the lead paragraph of sort of the new ferocity of the web and how that made it harder for politicians to keep control of their public image. All 3 of those examples they offered in the lead were Politico stories. The most recent was a story that we broke about Governor Palin's wardrobe, the $150,000 wardrobe bonds. That was a Politico story. And needless to say, it was our top traffic driver in the month of October. Incidentally, Gene Cummings, who's replacing Mike Allen tomorrow, was the author of that story, and the one who, just by old-fashioned journalism, found it by leafing through public disclosure documents, going, wait a minute, what's it to Macy's? Bloomingdale's, wherever. Neiman Marcus, I guess, is where she got it. At Macy's, she would have got a better deal, I guess. John Edwards, here's the story. I wasn't especially proud of it because it was so trivial, but when we first launched, it was our top traffic driver for basically the first year. Was John Edwards' $400 haircut. Now, we didn't hype that story. It was literally 4 paragraphs on our blog post, on Ben Smith's reported blog on Democratic politics. Again, same thing, went through disclosure forms, $400 for personal services. What is that? His haircut. Why did he get so much traffic? The whole world linked to it. So we have our moments of pride by taking advantage of this web world. I must say, and this is of special relevance to this conference, our moments of greatest horror have also been when we've made mistakes, and the speed that the web operates in, which we operate, and the amplifying power of the web has come back, and in ways that have been magnified the damage and been quite painful. The biggest one, definitely the most notorious, was not long after we launched. The same reporter who had the John Edwards hair scoop and had countless scoops this cycle. He's a brilliant reporter named Ben Smith. He wrote, based on old-fashioned reporting, but it turned out not to be accurate reporting from his sources, that John Edwards would drop out of the presidential race because of Elizabeth Edwards' cancer. There was supposed to do a news conference in which Edwards was going to announce his intentions at noon. Ben Smith's blog item went up at like 11:34, something like that. We instantly got linked everywhere. We were being, cable news, Politico reports, getting messages on my BlackBerry. Wow, great scoop. And then I started getting messages on my BlackBerry from Edwards campaign people. You're about to be very embarrassed. Good lesson. I mean, this was early in our existence, and fortunately, the incident didn't have the power to kill the credibility of our organization. So it was a terribly grave thing, and made more so, to my mind, or more painful by the kind of a classic sort of journalistic bullshit story. Not just the fact that it was wrong, but who cares if you're first with something at 11:34 when you're going to find out the actual truth at noon? Why take the curve at high speed when you can find the answer in less than a half hour? There's not really a good answer to that, other than that's what journalists constitutionally have done as long as there have been journalists. I have a feeding frenzy over who the vice presidential nominee is going to be, who's going to be first with that, whether it's John King at CNN or Andrea Mitchell at NBC, but they have an intense competition. Somebody gets it at 7:01, the other person in the morning, the other person confirms it at 7:02. It's our nature to be competitive, and we do it. And as I said, in this web world, there's a huge advantage to being first. If you're first, you get the traffic, you get the recognition. In this case, we were first and sorely regretted it. That was not a question of us being with any legal exposure, it's reputational exposure. I do think this is where, at least as I understand the law, the remedies for error merge. You can limit your reputational exposure and your legal exposure, as I understand it, by being as fully as transparent as possible. And this was what, that mistake that Ben Smith made was one I felt that was a test for us as a young organization as to what our real values are. I felt the only way to reckon with that incident was by being as open with readers as to what happened. I had been, first off, the damn error was only up live on our site for maybe 10, 15 minutes before we took it down. When we realized it was wrong at that time, the damage was certainly done. But I had Ben Smith write what we call a TikTok. The journalists here will know it as a sort of a narrative of exactly what happened on almost a minute-by-minute basis. And we left that story up on the site prominently on the homepage for the next 2 full days, many times, more than the original error, explaining what had happened, explaining how the error took place, our own lapses of judgment. It was a case of us being, there were editors involved. It's not like editors were AWOL. But the editors themselves were sharing the reporter's enthusiasm for, like, let's hit the gas, let's get there, let's get it right, instead of performing the responsibility of editors of, tell me exactly who, exactly how. You absolutely sure? We didn't give the campaign sufficient opportunity to respond, and therefore to wave us off. It's a mistake, and you can read about the mistake in painful anatomical detail, by going back on our site and looking at that story. I felt that the transparency and accountability was the remedy for an error. As I understand it, when these issues of accuracy, misjudgments, and entering the legal realm, at least our lawyers say, well, that is one way of limiting your exposure. If you make a mistake, even alive with this one, you can mitigate that by being and fast in correcting that mistake and explaining it. There is that's my view of this. I'm often get asked to be kind of a spokesman for new media because Politico is a new media platform, and our existence is itself a reflection of just how rapidly the world is changing. But I'm an unlikely spokesman. My values are traditional journalistic values. My mindset is a traditional journalistic mindset. Not surprisingly, I grew up in a very traditional newspaper. I believe the traditional journalistic model is defunct. Whether you work at an old paper like the Washington Post, a new paper like Politico, you have to be consumed with that question, as was said in the introduction, of what's next. And I do think that means being faster. It means being constantly vigilant to sort of how to drive the conversation. And in doing so, there are hazards, and the way to navigate those hazards is through transparency, and it is through falling back on first principles. I would definitely rather be second than wrong. It just makes the job of editors, who in some ways have become defunct. An editor can't set the national agenda the way it was in the old days. It, in other ways, gives editors even more serious responsibilities of how to not just vet stories, but to create a mindset and a psychology of self-vetting among reporters. Most of the younger people I hire never came from a place like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post. They don't have this orientation. They don't have these values. So it's incumbent upon us as an older generation of journalists to train them. And so that the challenge is, I think, is to vindicate old values, but also make them relevant to a new age. So with that, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about 24/7 news cycle. And are your reporters then basically working 24/7? Is there any shift work? And if they're not, if you are working 24/7, are you a little worried about burnout?
You're not a labor lawyer, by the way.
I was once.
Our reporters do not work 24/7. We do probably spend more time than the traditional newspaper thinking about scheduling and how to keep a site vital around the clock. And even though you don't necessarily need to be vital at 3 in the morning, you do need to be really well positioned if something big does happen at 3 in the morning, how you're going to react. I will say the reporters that seem to thrive most in this web world, they don't work 24/7, but they somehow seem to give the impression of it. I can't tell you the number of people who ask me about my job. I was like, I never sleep. And the answer is, I think, a couple hours a night. Most of our staff, we need sleep, but they do manage to, like Ben Smith, Jonathan Martin, they're bloggers. Not bloggers of the sort we think of, like some guy in his basement spouting out opinions. They run a reported blog, and those guys work like the devil. They get up in the morning and figure, okay, what can I do before going to work to, pop a couple items on the site. Before they go to bed at night, they will do the same. So anyway, I hope that they don't unionize, because that could get expensive. But they're really committed to the craft, and they work hard to help. Yes, sir.
You talked about what's next, and I guess you guys put Politico 44 out last week.
Right.
I was wondering how that's going and what your plans are with it.
Thank you for the question. You give me an opportunity to do a little advertising at your invitation. One of the things we got asked a lot, since we didn't have great traffic during the campaign, it was clear we were riding a big wave of national interest. Virtually every site that covered politics saw its traffic soar during the campaign. It was like, well, what are you going to do when that wave crashes and then crashes as it did on election day? The way we've answered that question is we expect there to be just as intense interest in this new administration. And we've responded to that by creating something called Politico 44, obviously Obama, the 44th president, that kind of combines the elements of a blog and its own homepage. It's meant as a sort of a real-time diary of the Obama presidency, in which we are constantly writing new items and carrying them throughout the day. So you can basically follow in pretty much real time everything that he's doing. At the same time, we're also doing lots of enterprise reporting. But we don't want to. There's nothing novel about kind of round-the-clock reporting. Associated Press and Reuters have been doing it for years. But doing that kind of reporting with sort of more personality, more voice, and more enterprise, that is something comparatively new. It used to be your enterprise reporting you do it until Sunday. In this environment, you can't do that. Yes, sir.
As you go for the real-time look at the Obama administration, how do you avoid basically casting judgment and deciding things are good ideas and bad ideas as they're announced before we have time to watch a policy proposal play out? Or if he names the Secretary of State, you're going to be up on Politico 44 talking, oh, is this good, is this bad? How do you make sure that you're not leaping to judgment before we ever get a chance to see things happen?
Well, I will say that whether it's a virtue or a flaw or some of both, we don't really put much stock in our site about making interpretive judgments as to a good idea or a bad idea. We do invite that from outsiders who contribute to our pages. We've got something that's we think kind of an intriguing idea called the Arena, which we've signed up. The moment we're up to a few hundred people, sort of Washington we've got members of Congress, we've got academics, political operatives who are in the arena, and we don't ask them to write long things, just a paragraph or two, in some cases a sentence or two about the issues of the day. So we might say, Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, good idea or not? And then we publish the answers almost in a blog format. We ourselves don't try to tackle that, whether this is a good appointment or not. It's definitely true that most of us who work there are kind of political junkies. And so we don't even gravitate to the question of whether something is ideologically or even practically that great an idea. I had a friend who said, he goes, I can see why you call it Politico and not Substance Co. In other words, that's who we are. Yes, sir.
How do you handle what are your conversations about feedback loops and user-generated content and so forth?
We've had mixed results on that. I confess this is one that's giving me, not from a legal standpoint, just from an editorial standpoint, a devil of the time. At the beginning, we felt it was important to allow comments on our sites, in the blog area with no registration, and in main story pages with most minimal non-invasive registration and anonymous. Anybody can go sign on a story. They can use a handle. We have their email, but we don't ask for their name, their address, their age, or their income, or any of that. We decided it was important to do that because we're, for heaven's sake, we're a new site. The last thing we're trying to do is put limits to people's engagement with the site. And at the beginning, it was painful because there'd be stories and comments, and there'd be like free comments or whatever, sort of advertising that our traffic wasn't that big in the very early days. As our traffic grew rapidly, the number of comments grew rapidly, and it's not uncommon for a story on our site that if it's a big one, have 3,000-4,000 people commenting on it. Most of those comments, many of them are people carrying on a conversation with themselves. Some guy who Vlad the Impaler seems to comment on every one of our stories. And he's arguing with Hector or whatever. To me, it's the equivalent of like a barroom brawl. These jerks just shut up. And I've sort of said, we don't need it at this point. Why don't we get much higher registration, limit the comments, or go to strictly moderated comments? And the answer to that is the kind of web purists on our staff don't like that. They think it's sort of antithetical to the free-for-all spirit that we want on the web. And I would say also that putting on a business hat, like if you were to cut that off, you'd see time on site go down. And that is an important statistic that advertisers look at, and as an advertiser-supported site, we obviously care about that.
In answering the question, what's next, you adopted the language of moving from an institutional age to entrepreneurial age.
Yeah.
Political scientists, Alan Earhart, for example, or Alan's a journalist, in a book called The United States of Ambition, adopted the language of moving from establishment politics to movement politics.
Right.
Political scientists talk about this in terms of cycles. So at some point we're going to move back to presumably an institutional age or a new establishment. So the question is, what will the new establishment be like? Who will it be? Will it be Politico, Real Clear, a few dominant websites, or are we forever going to have the wild, wild web? A complete, open, decentralized, utterly fragmented.
Well, I will say of Alan Earhart, who I don't think I've ever met, that when I wrote my book, The Survivor, the history of the Clinton White House, he gave me, by far, my most lavish review on the front page of the New York Times book review. So brilliant guy.
He is brilliant.
Really brilliant guy. I don't think I agree with him on that. I don't see how the hell the pendulum swings back to an establishment age, at least in journalism, maybe in other units of political culture, social culture. Even there, I have a hard time seeing it. The nature of the computer is that it empowers individuals. It's a more narrow question of whether certain brands get dominance just by virtue of habit. The Drudge Report, we first became acquainted with it in 1997, obviously in a sort of legal context, the Sidney Blumenthal lawsuit, when he put the false rumors about it. It wasn't long after that the Lewinsky story broke and really put Drudge on the map. He told me 10 years ago that Drudge is still going to be a very important journalistic filter in 2008, as he is. I talk about links. If you want to see and it's true at the Washington Post, New York Times, anywhere the link that's going to drive the most traffic is either going to be Drudge or Yahoo News. Yahoo, a huge company, Drudge, some guy in an apartment in Miami Beach. So, why is that? I think tons of people clearly go to Drudge just because they find it a reliable aggregator. There's really no barrier to entry. You could start an aggregation site this afternoon that might be superior in its editorial sensibility or whatever to Drudge. People are in the habit of going to Drudge. I think that's what Real Clear Politics, and we've done a lot of stuff with those guys at Politico and wish them well. I think that's what they're banking on, that there's a brand name. They started Real Clear Sports, Real Clear Finance, that kind of thing. So maybe that is true. But my view is for anybody who's actually in the business and not just aggregating but providing content, if you're not swimming, you're sinking. I don't think that we're going back to some more static world.
How do you think the Politico.com relates to the marketplace of ideas?
We're trying to relate more centrally to it. It was not a strong emphasis of ours when we first started. We were just trying to break news. And based on our kind of area of expertise, which a lot of times was sort of horse race, sausage making news. That's been our has been still heavy is our emphasis. But we didn't set out just to create a kind of superficial buzz-driven site. We're not trying to be for politics, but Tina Brown is trying to be with her new Daily Beast or whatever it is, which is sort of loudly about buzz. For the joke about substance go, I do want to be proud of the publication we put out and think it contributes to the discourse. More policy coverage is part of that. One of the people who works for us is David Rogers of the Wall Street Journal, the dean of the Capitol Hill Press Corps, spent 30-some years up there with the Wall Street Journal, before that the Boston Globe. So any publication's got David Rogers working for it has got a pretty good substantive rudder. Now, the actual realm of ideas and argument, we like to sponsor that discussion. We don't like to really contribute to it. In our own books, we're not the New Republic or the Weekly Standard or Foreign Affairs. I mentioned that arena. I think that's probably our biggest contribution. We've got lots of really, really substantive people signed up for that who do care passionately about ideas.
Some reporters are setting the agenda for the other news media who used to sit in this room.
Those people, right?
Who could sit in this room. And now it's your handful of people who are setting that political agenda.
I don't want my point to be mistaken. I believe the agenda setting capacity does no longer exist in any kind of concentrated form. On any given day, it might be in an infinite number of people who potentially setting the agenda. Who set the agenda on the day when Barack Obama's bitter comment about people being bitter about guns, rural voters are turned away from Democrats because they're bitter about the economy and so forth. Well, in that case, it was the woman for Huffington Post, who was not a reporter, but for purposes of that night, kind of was playing one, was at the fundraiser and wrote it down, and up it went on Huffington Post. So that day, Huffington Post sets the agenda. Maybe tomorrow it'll be the Washington Post that sets the agenda with some investigative piece, or it'll be Politico with some piece that Ben Smith. So I reject the idea that anyone anymore, as an institution, sets the agenda. Individual journalists do. And I do, for all I'm kind of joking about it, I do also reject the idea that the sort of ephemera of politics is necessarily triumphant over really more serious argument ideas in this new world. It's true that Ben Smith's item about Jonathan's haircut was massively trafficked, but so have been the kind of the most sophisticated analysis pieces that we've written. If you write them with enough punch and style, those pieces get just as much traffic, actually far more traffic than other more conventional pieces. So there's definitely journalism generally, I'm talking about us, is not in a race for the bottom. I know sometimes it seems that way. You're clicking around on the cable shows, but I don't believe that it's in a race for the bottom. The web has got a bottom and a top, and I think that they both can thrive.
Can you talk about the Politico newspaper and why there's a need for a print version and how it relates to Politico.com?
Sure. I'm very pessimistic from the standpoint of metropolitan dailies about the future of print. You look at those trend lines on advertising lineage and circulation, and I think those places are walking around with cancer. For us, we have a very small print presence, about 27,000 copies get printed. They get overwhelmingly distributed on Capitol Hill, and that paper edition. There's no story in the paper that's not also on the web. Lots of stories on the web that don't make it in the paper, but it is edited with a heavy emphasis on Congress and the kind of stories that will drive the conversation on Capitol Hill. And we'll keep publishing it as long as it's got sort of publishing vitality, which it does. We can often tell if people are seeing stories on paper, we're hearing people talk about them. On Capitol Hill, a lot of people are sitting around in meetings, they're riding the little subway trains from the offices to the Capitol. Plenty of people have time for print. A lot of these members of Congress are not exactly into the web. The series of tubes, isn't that what Ted Stevens called it? So with those people, maybe we should get like a large print edition. But even the younger people, who obviously are probably most consuming Politico most frequently on the web, even like those people like the print edition. You take it home, whatever. So it sort of clearly works for us as a vehicle for delivering our journalism. And because of its success in that, we'll also still make a lot of money for advertising from it.
You described the old world of journalism, the new world. Take some major event from that old world, Pentagon Papers, Watergate. Does it turn out any differently if something comparable happens today?
Great questions. The thing that worries me most about the transition from the old world is that stories have less impact. They might have more impact in the moment. The Pentagon Papers would come out now, and like cable would go wild, and so there, in that sense, probably the whole country would be aware of the Pentagon Papers and inflamed by it in a way that, even in 1971, relatively small elite circle of people would have been really paying attention to it. And maybe other people would be vaguely aware, there's some court case, or didn't the New York Times publish something they weren't supposed to, but like now you'd have like round the clock, furious coverage.
People would talk about it
Russian
before
would
they
be
read
talking
it.
about it, and then we'd be on to the next uproar. What the modern news culture has done, at least for people like me, maybe like a younger generation has a more adaptive mechanisms in their brains or something like that. For me, it's like shredded my memory. I can't remember like what the hell it was we were all worked up about 3 months ago. Something to do with Hillary Clinton, like maybe being a Muslim. She shot somebody in Bosnia because she was bitter. and it's like, whatever, it's just all melted there. You don't really have to worry about it because you can just go Google it and find out what it was. But at least for me, the print edition, I can, for big events of the sort you described, I can visually picture what the front page of the paper looked like. There's that story by Bob Woodward here, and a sidebar by David Broder right there, and it's like a mental organizing device almost for me. We don't really have that now. That's too bad. But the more substantive implication of that, I think, is big. Like we have a whole society walking around with ADD. And I don't think without trying to sound great, I really think it's troubling for our discourse and for democracy. One thing it does, I'd say, more to this point, one thing it does is it minimizes. It reduces accountability of public officials. No matter what you get caught doing, if you can ride it out for a couple of days, and at the same time you ride it out, use your ideological partisans, whether they're liberal on MSNBC or they're conservative on Fox and Rush Limbaugh, to politicize that question, thus making the factual issues at stake kind of irrelevant to the ideological argument waging back and forth around those facts. Whatever, you're fine. So it's the enemy of accountability. It doesn't matter what the truth is. Politicize it, ride it out, make sure your team, whether you're on the shirts or the skin, is with you, and then, it doesn't matter what the facts of the matter are. So anyway, that's pretty troubling, and let me back for next year's conference.
On that happy note,